Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's web seminar featuring Dr. Jim Cummins. It is nice to see returning GCRF participants, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We hope you continue participating in future web seminars. Your moderators for this afternoon are Dr. Peggy Albert, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and me, Jin Kyung-jung, Reading Writing Literacy doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania, and Myung-eun Bang, Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We also have a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University. Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the field of literacy and language arts. As a research project, we seek volunteers for our study of critical literacy professional development in online spaces. Please type your name into the chat area if you are willing to participate in a brief interview. A research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. We also invite you to take our survey. The hyperlink is located on the GCRF website. During today's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Cummins will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in today's web seminar, so please use the star tool located to the immediate left of this slide and click your location on the web. Dr. Jim Cummins is a professor at the Ontario Institute for the Studies in Education of the University of Toronto, who studies language development and literacy of learners of English as an additional language. His scholarship focuses on basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency, terms that he coined as reference processes that help teachers understand learners' language abilities. Dr. Cummins holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and has received numerous awards, including the International Reading Association's Albert J. Harris Award. He is author of numerous books and articles. His newest book, entitled Big Ideas for Expanding Minds, teaching English language learners across the curriculum, addresses academic language for English learners, contains many strategies for teachers, and promotes the overall academic process on ELS. He is also author of Literacy, Technology, and Diversity, Teaching for Success in Changing Times, Language, Power, and Pedagogy, Bilingual Children in the Crossfire, and Identity Text, the collaborative creation of power in multilingual schools. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Cummins and his presentation entitled Reversing Underachievement, the Rocky Road from Literacy Research to Policy and Practice.
Hi, everybody. This is Jim Cummins. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate all of you being here, too. We've had a little bit of technical difficulty in the sense that my slides have not loaded on my machine, so I'll be letting the moderators know when I'm changing slides. The basic point that I want to make in my presentation is that when we look at the way in which research and literacy has been used and has been applied to policy and practice, we see a variety of misinterpretations of the research that have had a very negative effect on policies that have been implemented to close the achievement gap between social groups. And I'll try and outline briefly what I mean by that, and look at what the research is actually saying and the differences that could make for achievement. So let me just move to the first slide, the overview slide. And when we look at this, and I'm going to be talking mainly about the U.S. context, but the issues that have appeared there can be generalized to some extent to other contexts. When we look at the recent era of educational policy in the United States, roughly between 2002 and 2015, this is the era of No Child Left Behind. it's been characterized, not just in my view, but in the perspective of many people, by the dominance of ideological narratives over empirical research. Some of the examples of this can be seen in the what I would call evidence-free uses of standardized tests, the perspective that standardized tests are necessary for accountability and they've got to be implemented in an intensive way. The refusal to acknowledge research findings regarding English language learners or bilingual students' academic trajectories, and the distortion of research findings regarding how to teach reading effectively. So the reading policies implemented in both the United States and UK during the past 15 years have been out of alignment with the research evidence because they've privileged one set of research findings relating to reading and how to teach it effectively and ignored a very different set. They've privileged a very limited perspective of more individualistic-oriented researchers to view reading and writing as autonomous cognitive processes. And as a result, these policies have ignored social determinants of literacy attainment, and particularly the importance of instruction that maximizes literacy engagement and promotes what Patrick Maniak has called identities of competence associated with literacy practices. And I'm going to argue that in order to close the achievement gap, we've got to ground our literacy policies and practice rigorously in the research evidence relating to three issues. Number one, which groups underachieve? What are the causes of underachievement? And which instructional approaches have promise of high impact in responding to these underlying causes? So if we move to the next slide, let me just give a very brief sketch of the opposing ideological narratives, again, in the United States context. And one view, which has been dominant in policy and was, I guess, most prominently expressed in the 2010 documentary film, Waiting for Superman, attributes the problems of American education to the influence of what they call bad teachers who cannot be held accountable and gotten rid of because they're protected by teacher unions. And the proposed solutions to this perceived problem involve eliminating unions' right to collective bargaining, expanding non-unionized charter schools, and using high-stakes standardized tests to measure not only the progress of students, but also the effectiveness of teachers and the teacher education programs that certify them. This ideological narrative, which is largely evidence-free, has been pushed by what Diane Ravitch, in her book Reign of Error, has called the corporate reformers. And these corporate reformers have been very influential in both the Bush and Obama administrations. Opposed to the corporate reformer perspective are a large majority of educational researchers, people like David Berliner, Linda Darling-Hammond, and many more, who dispute the blanket generalization that American schools are failing and highlight instead the fact that underachievement is concentrated in schools serving low-income and racially or culturally marginalized students. These researchers argue that school improvement will result from a greater focus on equity rather than the punitive use of high-stakes standardized tests. In particular, it's essential to address socioeconomic disparities between schools, such as the unequal funding that characterizes many school districts in the United States. Their skepticism about the efficacy of intensive standardized testing to improve achievement is consistent with findings from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which concluded that the Program for International Student Achievement, their large-scale look at achievement patterns in many countries around the world over the last 15 years, they find, and this is a quote, that PISA does not show the prevalence of standardized tests to be systematically related to performance. So in other words, the using standardized tests in the way that No Child Left Behind is mandated essentially makes no contribution to achievement. If we look at ideologies, and moving on to the next slide, it's worth just very briefly making a couple of points about them. Ideologies are always implied both in research and policy making. And they're implied in the choice of research questions, the methodologies used, the way data is interpreted, and dissemination strategies. Now, ideologies are not problematic in themselves. They become problematic only when they become unhinged from the research evidence. And this is precisely what's happened in the US context, where ideologies concerning legitimate forms of research, the nature of reading, and the goals of education generally have led researchers and policymakers to implement policies and practices that have proven ineffective in reducing the achievement gap between social groups. And in particular, social variables related to socioeconomic status and societal power relations have been ignored and or dismissed under the mantra of no excuses. In other words, when people like Richard Rothstein and David Berliner and others talk about the strong relationship between socioeconomic variables and achievement, that's seen by the corporate reformers as just making excuses for the failure of teachers and schools. If we look at just one example of evidence-free policies relating to English language learners, I'll give you this example just to illustrate what I mean by that term. English language learners pose an awkward dilemma for policymakers who envisage expansion of the use of standardized tests to enforce accountability. And under No Child Left Behind, ELL students have been exempted from testing only in their first year of learning English. So during their first year of arrival in the United States, students are exempted from having to take the standardized test. But after that year, they're lumped in with everybody else, and their scores are interpreted along with the scores of other students as reflective of the quality of instruction in a particular school. However, the expectation that all English language learners should be performing at grade level after 1 year of learning English is totally without empirical foundation. And you can see that from the next slide. The graph there is presenting data from a study that I was able to do many years ago, about more than 30 years ago, in the Toronto board, where I was able to reanalyze data from about 1,200 immigrant students who were learning English as a second language and who had arrived at different ages. LOR in the graph stands for length of residence. AOA down at the bottom is the age on arrival. The metric down at on the vertical axis is essentially standard deviation units. And you can see that students who arrived, the three groups of students who arrived and had been in Canada for just 1 year, were about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. After 3 years, they were up to 1 standard deviation below the mean, but it was roughly between 5 and 7 years that was required before they were getting close to grade norms. And that's confirmed by many other studies that have been done in different countries, the United States, Israel, and elsewhere. And just as another example, a study carried out by Parrish and colleagues in California after the implementation of Proposition 227 that mandated English-only instruction in most schools, showed that after 3 years of English-only instruction, only 12% of English learners had acquired sufficient academic English to be redesignated as English proficient. So if policy says that after 1 year, students should be at grade level, and if they're not, it's because teachers are bad teachers or the school is an ineffective school, that is totally out of sync with what the research data are actually saying. And so you look at the position this puts students in, look at the position it puts teachers in. If a teacher is teaching in a school that has a significant number of English language learners, and many of whom may be from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and she is viewed or labeled as a bad teacher because her students are not at grade level after 1 year, why would anybody want to teach in schools like that? And so policies have major implications for students and teachers when they're out of sync with reality. If we move on to look at the issue of reading and the prevalence of evidence-free policy making in this area in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and elsewhere also. Let me just give you a little brief tour of the last 15 years or so. First of all, the National Reading Panel, which reported in year 2000, adopted what many researchers would view as a very narrow focus regarding what constituted legitimate research. Only experimental and quasi-experimental research were considered legitimate. A major conclusion that they drew is that, and this is a quote from the report, there's strong evidence substantiating the impact of systematic phonics instruction on learning to read. Subsequently, the Bush administration implemented its Reading First program, which allocated about $1 billion a year to helping students from low-income backgrounds learn to read. The program predominantly funded programs that incorporated an intensive phonics focus in the early grades. Typically, scripted programs were preferred, and programs that had any hint of being balanced were seen as being not scientifically based. For example, in New York City, the program that they were using at the time was a program called Month by Month Phonics, but they were initially refused almost $40 million of funding from Reading First because that program was not considered scientifically proven or scientifically based. And the reason that it wasn't considered scientifically based was because it included an emphasis on writing, basically writing being seen as a way for students to sound out relationships between the sounds of the words and the written form. And it also included classroom libraries. And both of these were seen as violating principles of scientific orientations to reading by the Reading First panel. The National Reading Panel almost totally ignored the role of print access and literacy engagement, despite extensive research documenting its impact on reading comprehension, and I'll get into that research in a moment. So, when we look at what the National Reading Panel actually found, as opposed to how it was interpreted, and how some of the researchers involved kind of backgrounded aspects of what it found, it's very different. For example, policymakers and many researchers ignored the fact that for normally achieving and low achieving readers, systematic phonics instruction showed no relationship to reading comprehension beyond grade 1. Erie and her colleagues, in an article in Review of Educational Research, acknowledged this pattern. For example, these are quotes. They say that among the older students in 2nd through 6th grades, phonics instruction was not effective for teaching spelling or teaching reading comprehension. And readers in 2nd through 6th grades classified as low achieving revealed no overall effects of phonics instruction. And that those admissions in the article and also in the actual report seem to be at variance with the message that their article and the report tried to communicate about the centrality of systematic phonics. For example, the title of their article was Systematic Phonics Instruction Helps Students Learn to Read, but it could just as accurately have read Systematic Phonics Instruction Does Not Help Students to Develop Reading Comprehension After Grade 1. If we look at the consequence of this ideological narrative that all you need to do to produce good readers is give them a solid grounding in phonemic awareness and phonics in the early years. You've only got to look at the effects of the Reading First evaluation. Their impact study, their final impact study, showed, and these again are quotes, Reading First did not produce a statistically significant impact on student reading comprehension test scores in grades 1, 2, or 3. It produced a positive and statistically significant impact on decoding among first grade students tested in one school year, and it had no statistically significant impacts on student engagement with print. So basically, $6 billion was largely poured down the drain because of ideological narratives relating to what the research was saying, dominating and obscuring what the research was actually saying. If we move on to another major report that focused on second language learners, and the National Literacy Panel, which reported in 2006. This is a very comprehensive report that I think has a lot of very useful aspects to it. But again, when we look at the way they interpreted the research on reading engagement, it's very problematic. The chapter in the report that focused on this was one by Timothy Shanahan and Isabel Beck. And they claimed they could only find 9 studies that encouraged reading, or that looked at the effects of encouraging reading and writing or involved adults reading to children. By contrast, a meta-analysis by Jim Lindsay in 2010 of 108 studies of print access identified 44 rigorous studies, in other words, studies that employed experimental or quasi-experimental designs. So a significant amount of data was just sidelined in the review that Shanahan and Beck did. And I don't have the time to go into detail, but some of this is documented in the paper that I think people have access to, called Literacy Policy and Curriculum. They totally misinterpret the study that Ellie and Mangubite did on book flood initiatives in Fiji, Newman's Books Aloud program in the US, which documented very significant impacts of providing greater access to books at the preschool and early grade levels was omitted. And a study by Tizard and colleagues in the UK, which documented major gains in reading for grades 1 and 2 students as a result of sending books home for children to read with their parents, was also omitted. So when we look at, moving on to the what the research is actually saying, I want to make a case that the research is suggesting that print access and literacy engagement are key determinants of the extent to which students will develop strong literacy skills. Now, the logic here is, I think, fairly compelling and fairly transparent. We find academic language primarily in printed text rather than in everyday conversation. If we look just at lexical aspects, we find a much greater preponderance of low-frequency Latin and Greek origin words in books and in printed text, whereas these are relatively rare in everyday conversation, where we use much more high-frequency Anglo-Saxon origin words. And passive voice is found much more frequently in academic texts than in everyday conversation. So there are clear differences between the kind of language we use in these two contexts. And so students' opportunities to broaden their vocabulary knowledge and develop strong reading comprehension skills are likely to be greatly enhanced when they have abundant access to printed texts and engage actively with these texts. And so if we look at what the research is saying, there have been several very comprehensive reviews of the research on extensive reading over the last 30 years. I mentioned the one by Jim Lindsay. Steve Krashen has a review in his book, The Power of Reading. And if we also look at findings produced more recently involving hundreds of thousands of students by the OECD's PISA program, I think a convincing case can be made. So if we look at some of the data that came out of the PISA study, they looked at reading attainment of 15-year-olds initially in about 27 countries. They've now increased that to many, many more countries. And one of their initial findings was that the level of a student's reading engagement is a better predictor of literacy performance than his or her socioeconomic background, indicating that cultivating a student's interest in reading can help overcome home disadvantages. That's a quote from one of their reports. One of the people who's been championing the role of literacy engagement and reading engagement in the United States over the last 15 or so years has been John Guthrie, who's a cognitive psychologist at the University of Baltimore. And he cites the PISA data as showing that students whose family background was characterized by low income and low education, but who are highly engaged readers, substantially outscored students who came from backgrounds with higher education and higher income, but who themselves were less engaged readers. He goes on to say, based on a massive sample, this finding suggests the stunning conclusion that engaged reading can overcome traditional barriers to reading achievement, including gender, parental education, and income. More recent OECD studies on reading engagement show that there's about a one-third overlap between the effects of socioeconomic status and the effects of reading engagement. In other words, what this implies is that schools can potentially push back the negative effects of low-SES by about one-third if they strongly promote literacy engagement among students, particularly students from lower income backgrounds. Now contrast this with what Reading First did. Reading First punished schools. They refused to give money to schools and school districts that had any hint of encouraging students to read. So classroom libraries were verboten. They, in the New York case, that was very clearly stated. Writing, a focus on encouraging students to write, was characterized as not scientifically based. And so the impact of these data are totally at variance with the kind of policies that have been implemented in the United States and some other places over the last 15 or so years. The next slide tries to pull some of this information together in what I call the literacy engagement framework. And what this is saying is that when we look at literacy achievement, the most direct determinant of achievement is the degree to which students get access to print and become actively engaged with literacy. If we ask how we can get students from English learner backgrounds or students from low-income backgrounds engaged with literacy, there's four portals or four points to keep in mind. And some of these are similar to the general understanding, some of them are different. I'm not going to go into detail except in one or two, but the 4 points are we've got a scaffold meaning. In other words, if we've got students who are coming to school who are still have gaps in terms of their knowledge of English, teachers have got to know how to make that input comprehensible to them and support them in both understanding and using language. The ESL toolkit that's embodied in programs or packages like SciAP or in California and in the west of the United States, Project GLAD, have a strong focus on scaffolding meaning. There's no real dispute that I'm aware of in terms of the importance of that. The second point is that instruction has got to connect to students' lives. And this is based on findings that have been established since the 1930s, showing that the importance of students' background knowledge in terms of their ability to understand instruction. So if students are lacking background knowledge, we need to build that background knowledge so that they can understand the instruction more effectively. Now, depending on one's orientation, activating background knowledge can be interpreted in a narrow or a broader way. Advocates of direct instruction and the kind of instruction that was embodied in Reading First might say, yes, we believe in activating background knowledge, but how they interpret that is that we remind students what they learned in the previous lesson before we teach them the next lesson. Educators who are coming from a more critical perspective would interpret connecting to students' lives as activating and recognizing the funds of knowledge that are in students' communities, and seeing activating prior knowledge in a much broader way as connecting the instruction, connecting the curriculum up with students and their communities' lives and experiences. The third point, in terms of what we need to do, what classrooms need to do to get students actively engaged with literacy, is we've got to implement instruction that affirms students' identities. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that in a moment. And finally, we need to extend students' knowledge of language, how it works. We need to demystify how it works. And that includes teaching phonics. That includes teaching phonological awareness. It includes an explicit focus on vocabulary instruction. But as a means to help students use language effectively and powerfully. Now, there's relatively little disagreement in the broader literature on the importance of scaffolding, meaning the importance of extending language and demystifying how academic language in particular works, I think is also largely agreed upon. It's very much built into the Common Core state standards. In terms of connecting to students' lives, there's general agreement with that in principle, but it may mean different things according to the orientation of the particular person who's or researcher who's interpreting it. But issues related to print access and literacy engagement and issues related to identity have been almost totally omitted from policies and practices that have been pushed in the United States and in the UK over the last 15 or so years. So moving on to the next slide, if we step back and say, okay, if this is what the research on reading is saying and the research on achievement is saying, how do we develop evidence-based as opposed to evidence-free policies? There's three questions which we need to consider to do that. When we talk about underachievement, who are we talking about? What groups or which groups of students underachieve? What are the causal factors? Why do they underachieve? And then what high-impact evidence-based educational interventions are available? The next slide tries to answer some of those questions. It looks at student background in terms of three groups of students that in different parts of the world have been characterized by low achievement. Obviously, students who have special education needs could also be added to that as another group, but their needs are typically in terms of their aspects of their cognitive processing rather than social background variables. And so I'm not going to consider them at this point. But if we look at data from the OECD in terms of first and second generation immigrant students, it's evident that in many countries these students are underachieving, not in all countries, but in the majority of countries. In the United States, obviously, students from Spanish-speaking backgrounds and students from indigenous or Native American backgrounds have been characterized by large-scale underachievement. Again, as I've mentioned, there's been pretty consistent documentation that students from low-income or low-socioeconomic backgrounds tend to underachieve. And then finally, students from what I'm calling here marginalized status backgrounds tend to underachieve. These are students who are coming from racialized backgrounds, students whose communities have been subject to societal discrimination, often over centuries or over generations. If we think about African American students, if we think about Latina communities in the United States, if we look at First Nations communities in Canada, if we look at Roma students in Roma communities in Europe, they would all fall into what I'm calling marginalized status. So if we look at sources of potential disadvantage among these three groups, the obvious source of potential disadvantage for students who are coming to school not speaking the school language is that if the school does nothing to help them acquire that language, they're not going to do very well because it'll take them typically a few years to begin to understand what's going on in school, and by that time they've fallen so far behind that it's really difficult to catch up. So failure to understand instruction due to homeschool language differences is the obvious source of potential disadvantage for linguistically diverse students. The evidence-based instructional response to that would typically be highlighted is that we need to scaffold comprehension and production of language across the curriculum and then reinforce academic language across the curriculum. So this ties into the literacy engagement framework in highlighting the importance of scaffolding and activating background knowledge, connecting instruction to students' lives. It can be seen as a form of scaffolding also, and then reinforcing academic language across the curriculum. An obvious implication of this is that if this has to happen across the curriculum, it's not just the job of the ESL teacher or the language specialist. All teachers need to have the knowledge and be prepared to provide this kind of support. And that raises questions as to whether all teachers who are coming out of teacher education programs are getting the opportunities to acquire this kind of knowledge. It also raises questions about whether school principals have the knowledge to provide leadership in this area to support teachers in acquiring that knowledge. If we look at students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, there's a variety of factors there that have been suggested and documented by various people such as Richard Rothstein, David Berliner, and others that are seen as having clear relationships to subsequent underachievement. Things like inadequate prenatal care, inadequate nutrition, housing segregation, lack of cultural and material resources in the home due to poverty, the possibility of limited range of language interaction in the home, and then inadequate access to print in home and school, etc. Now, some of these schools can do very little about, such as housing segregation. Schools do try to address some of the issues related to nutrition through free and reduced lunch programs and sometimes breakfast programs. But if we look at where some of the highest impact might be, they concern students' limited access to print sometimes in their homes, because parents don't have the money to buy iPads, don't have the money to buy books. They may not be highly educated themselves. There may be limited access to library facilities in the neighborhoods that they're growing up in. And researchers such as Nell Duke and Newman and Solano and others have shown that schools serving low-income students tend to have much less rich library resources and print resources than schools serving more affluent students. So if we look at the data that I've briefly sketched in terms of the very significant impact of literacy engagement on achievement, one of the obvious things that schools can do to address the underachievement of students from low-income backgrounds is to maximize literacy engagement, to immerse them in a culture of print from the day they enter the school, and also reinforcing and demystifying how academic language works across the curriculum is essential. Finally, students from marginalized backgrounds, we have the obvious effect of societal discrimination in the past, certainly. Schools have reflected the societies that have funded them, and the discriminatory structures that have existed within the society have been reflected in schools. This may manifest itself in terms of low teacher expectations, or what Claude Steele has called stereotype threats, when there are stereotypes relating to particular groups in the society, that tends to have a negative effect on task performance. And generally, the effects of identity devaluation, both in school and in the society, are seen as sources of potential disadvantage. Logically, what that means, if we want to address those causes of underachievement for students from marginalized status backgrounds, is we need to make instruction relevant to their lives, connect instruction to their lives, and then affirm students' identities in association with literacy engagement. So if we have a pattern of coercive relations of power operating in the broader society, historically and sometimes currently, then schools have got to define their role, and individual educators need to define their role as challenging the operation of those coercive relations of power. And so if those coercive relations of power have operated to devalue the identities of students from marginalized groups, then a major aspect of school reform has got to be creating instructional context that enables students to develop identities of confidence in relation to literacy and other aspects of instruction. So if we move on to the next slide, when we look at those three groups, they're not separate groups. In many contexts, the same child, the same student will fall into all three categories. So if we look at a student from an immigrant student from a Spanish-speaking background in the United States, they're coming to school without knowledge of English. They're coming from often from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and they're coming from communities that have been discriminated against over centuries. And so all three of those factors, all three of those potential causal factors are operating to limit the potential achievement of students in those categories. And so that means that if we want to promote the academic achievement of English language learners, it's not enough just to provide scaffolding and focus only on language. We have to address the socioeconomic factors that are operating and what schools can do to address the effects of those, as well as the issues related to marginalized students. And when we look at the academic literature on these three groups, there tends to be a separation in that the same people are not talking about all three groups. We've got researchers such as myself and many others in the United States and internationally who have focused on issues related to bilingual education and language learning among immigrant background populations. But then you've got people who've focused on socioeconomic status directly. As I said, people like David Berliner, Linda Darling-Hammond, Robert Rothstein, and again, many others, whose focus has been on educational reform generally, and who may or may not have focused to any significant extent on issues related to language. And then when we look at issues related to racialized or marginalized background students, they've been addressed by researchers who focused on critical pedagogy and culturally responsive or relevant instruction, such as people like Geneva Gay, Gloria Latson-Billings, Joan Wink, etc. And so there hasn't been an integrated instructional response to say, okay, we need to take account of what the research is saying about reading if we're going to address the underachievement of students from marginalized social backgrounds. So let me just say a few words about the role of identity, affirmation, and enhancement. I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm just going to draw your attention to a quote from Gloria Latson-Billings in relation to African American students that I think sums up the issue very clearly. It says the problem that African American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. And a considerable amount of case study research suggests that identity devaluation in the wider society can be challenged effectively within schools by creating opportunities for students to use language, both first and second language, in powerful, in other words, in identity-affirming ways. There's a quotation on the next slide that I think again goes to the heart of the matter. This is from a student, a high school student called Cassandra Bice-Zog, who was completing her high school program in Hamilton in Ontario. And she made the point about identity. She's a First Nation student. She says, take away identity, and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think that they care about what goes on in the classroom? And I think that one quote sums up a lot of the research from anthropology and sociology relating to these issues. When I talk about powerful use of language, again, let me give you one or two examples. This is a dual language book written by three students originally from Pakistan who were in grade 7. And this was a culminating activity on a unit on immigration that they were doing. It was what in Canada is called a sheltered program. The teacher was an ESL teacher. She was also a content teacher, and all of the students in the class were from English as a second language backgrounds, or English language learning backgrounds. The two of the students, Sulmana and Kanta, had arrived about 3.5 years previously, but Madiha had just arrived about 6 weeks before they did this project, and her English was minimal. Now, in a typical classroom, a student like Madiha, who's just in the early stages of beginning English, might be able to write 2 or 3 painful sentences in a writing assignment if the only language that's acceptable is English. But because the teacher encouraged students to write in both languages, the students were writing the book for younger students who were also coming from an Urdu-speaking background, and she supported them strongly in writing the story in both languages. Madiha became a full participant in this project. The students discussed their what they were going to write in Urdu They created a composite character that incorporated experiences that all three of them had had. They figured out what the illustration should be like. They figured out what should be on each page. Then they wrote the first draft in English, conference with the teacher, got feedback from the teacher, finalized that English version, and then went back to translate that from English back into Urdu. Again, Medita being a full participant because her Urdu was probably better developed than that of the other two students. This is a 20-page book that's been up on a website. It's been read by thousands of people. And here's Medita's reflections on this book. And I think they kind of go to the heart of what I mean by powerful uses of language. She says, I'm proud of the new country because it is our story. Nobody else has written that story. And when we showed it to Miss Leone, their teacher, she said it was really good. She said, it's all about your home country and family and Canada. It's all attached. That's so good. I like that because it means she cares about her family and her country, not just Canada. Because she cares about us, that makes us want to do more work. And my parents were really happy to see that I was writing in both Urdu and English. My mother was happy because she knows that not everyone has that chance. And so you see the identity affirmation that comes from projects like this. When that English-only zone sign is taken down from classroom walls, the invisible sign that's often there, and students' previous knowledge of language, their linguistic accomplishments, their creativity is permitted to be expressed in both languages. It has powerful impact on students' engagement. Another example on a smaller scale comes from the class of a teacher called Robin Persad in Thornwood School in the Toronto area. This was a grade 4 ESL class. There was about 5 students from Arabic language backgrounds in the class. And one of the projects that Robin suggested that they do is to look at how Arabic and English are the same and different. They talked to their parents about this, and their project demystified not only how English works, but also how Arabic works. And the comparative purpose both affirmed their knowledge of Arabic as something positive, something worth keeping, and also enabled them to compare that with English. So just to sum up what I'm saying, a first step in any kind of reform process is to look at the image of the child we're sketching in our instruction. And this is a process that can happen at the school level. Is our instruction communicating to students that they're capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate, capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments, creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? The reforms that have been implemented over the last 15 or more years in the United States do not give this message to students in the 3 groups that I mentioned. Linguistically diverse students, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and students from marginalized communities. All of these students are at risk of not doing well in the test, the standardized tests. This means that the school may not pass the adequate yearly progress criterion. Teachers may lose their job. And so the curriculum has narrowed for students like this to exclude any kind of higher order thinking and any kind of creative project work for these students. And that is obviously totally counterproductive. When we look at reading in particular and the importance of linking up reading with identity affirmation, a couple of years ago, I just took a tour around an elementary school in Toronto and photographed things that were on the walls. And one of the teachers was obviously doing work on looking at why we read. And the sentence starter that students responded to was, reading makes me powerful because. And just here's one, reading makes me powerful because I get smarter and I learn more facts, I learn new words, and I'll never forget. Another one, reading makes me powerful because I learn new words and I love reading. One by Tasneem says, reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read. Someone can also trick you to do something that will get you into trouble. In other words, if you have poor literacy skills, that can be problematic in terms of being exploited. Reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary. so that when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words. So what the teacher was doing here was promoting literacy engagement by demystifying for students, or having them demystify for themselves, just how powerful reading can be and literacy generally in our lives. So just to wrap up, what I've been saying is that we need to go back to the research, look at what it's saying about print access and literacy engagement. We need to take account of the fact that identity negotiations are crucial, and current policies have not done that. And so the summary page just essentially wraps up what I've been saying. And the point that I want to make is down at the bottom. This interpretation of the research relating to achievement gaps and how to bridge these gaps is dramatically different than the interpretations that have dominated recent educational policies in both the US and UK. Okay, so I'll stop there and look forward to answering some of the questions that you've got.
Thanks, Dr. Cummings. That was really a very, very important talk that you gave for us, and it generated a number of different questions, and we have time for a few questions. And one of the major questions that participants were wondering about, how can we teachers push against the status quo to enact your model, given the required curriculum? That seemed to be a thread of questions throughout your talk. Would you respond to that, please?
Sure. I think it's an excellent question. And one of the sad things that current reforms have done is to essentially operate in an authoritarian way rather than an authoritative way, so that it's basically been a case of you do what we say regardless of whether there's any basis for what we say or not. I think the first thing that teachers can do is to develop a healthy skepticism about the mandates that have come down from on top. In this presentation, I've just sketched some of the problematic areas in relation to English language learners and reading instruction. But if we look at what we can do within our own schools in relation to things like literacy engagement, we can look at our own practice right now. Where are we? What are our current realities? We can look at where we'd like to go if we pursued our vision of what it means to be an educator and our knowledge of what the research is saying. And then we can talk about how we move in that direction. We may not be able to move as far as we want, but we can certainly strategize to see how we can be consistent with policies, but at the same time, and also not just be consistent with policies, but meet curriculum expectations, while at the same time enabling our students to develop strong literacy skills as we do that. If we don't start talking about it and plan developing language policies at the school level, then we become totally subject to the bullying that comes from on top. And so this requires, or at least will be certainly facilitated by strong leadership at the school that will be collaborative and will encourage teachers to engage in this kind of discussion. But it's certainly not easy, but we have to, I guess, reclaim our own agency, reclaim what people like Henry Giroux would call our status as transformative intellectuals, so that and that means that talking back up the hierarchy and holding people who are making policies accountable. Like if I was to say to somebody at the top of the Bush administration hierarchy that you just wasted $6 billion of our tax dollars, that's not being accountable. And yet they expect teachers at the level of schools to be accountable to criteria that are evidence-free. So I think we need to raise our voices.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have another question about how do you address literacy engagement for adult ELLs?
I think the same principles apply. The research related to literacy engagement and extensive reading is just as extensive among adults as it is for K-12 students. I think a good place to start, if we're looking at adults and adults who are taking courses in English, is the daily newspapers, and get them to become aware of what's going on in their communities, get them reading about current events, have them, if they're reading about global issues, for example, maybe have them contrast how some of these issues are written up in newspapers or websites from their countries of origin in comparison to their new context. Again, the goals of adults will vary in terms of learning English. Some of them may just want to be able to function more in everyday contexts. Others may want to pursue professional goals through English, where a wider range of English registers and vocabulary will be required. But for all groups, getting students to read extensively and compare and talk about things between their first language and their second language, I think is a very, very useful strategy.
Thank you for that. This one is really, I think, a very important question too, and that is, how can educators specifically address students' internalized negative perception of self and community identity?
Yeah, again, thank you for that question, because that relates directly to the kinds of issues that were sketched in that marginalized status column, where the internalization of a negative identity or negative sense of self is something that I think unfortunately characterizes a lot of students who do not succeed in graduating from high school. And basically, the first thing that I think we need to do is to acknowledge that this is an issue. And if we only focus on issues related to low socioeconomic status, or only focus on issues related to language differences, then we're probably not going to address these issues. And so we've got to talk about how we can enable students to do powerful things with language. And these may take a number of forms, but it goes back to that, the image of the student. Like, are we providing opportunities for students to engage in higher order thinking? Are we providing opportunities for them to use various kinds of tools and technologies in powerful ways? And to what extent do they have opportunities to showcase their intelligence, their creativity, etc.? If we don't adjust our instruction to enable them to showcase their talents, then they'll find identity affirmation in contexts outside the school. And so I think we need to strategize beyond just the mandated curriculum, beyond the kind of academic skills and expectations that are included in something like the Common Core State Standards. We need to bring in those social variables into our language planning and instructional planning at the school level.
Okay, that's fantastic. Unfortunately, Dr. Cummins, we have no more time for questions, but we really appreciate the time that you took for us to answer those questions. And now we'll just finish up the presentation with our moderators.